Me every weekday starting at 9 a.m. for the chance to hear full-length, unabridged opera, ballet, symphonic, and chamber music. I'll share news of local concert events that you may be interested in attending, background information about some of the greatest musical compositions ever written. Tune in weekdays 9 to 10 a.m. and Wednesday from 9 to 10:30.
KSJE is supported by San Juan Regional Medical Center, here to meet your urgent and emergent medical needs, whether they are COVID-19 related or not. Medical emergencies happen when you least expect them. Whether it's a stroke, heart attack, illness, or injury, San Juan Regional Medical Center's caregivers are here to provide care to you and your loved ones. Find out more online at sanjuanregional.com.
Eleven minutes past 8 o'clock. It is Thursday morning, July the 2nd. Good morning, everybody. I'm Scott Micklin. Thanks for tuning into KSJE, 90.9 FM over the air here in San Juan County, 103.3 FM up in Durango, Colorado, and of course you can listen anywhere from our website, ksje.com. Welcome also to our viewers who are watching this visual radio program streaming live to the KSJE YouTube channel and to our Facebook page. We're glad that you are with us. Coming up this morning, we're talking archaeology, and local archaeologist Paul Reid is my guest. We also have a special guest in the studio that we'll be meeting in just a moment, so that is coming up in the next few minutes right here on KSJE. And then, of course, at 9 a.m., it's our local information program about the coronavirus, COVID-19. Megan Kellam will be joining me here in Studio A, and we'll be getting a live update from San Juan County about conditions at the San Juan County Detention Center. We've been telling you about more positive cases among detainees there. We'll get an update this morning. Also, we'll be talking to two local doctors from San Juan Regional Medical Center about conditions at the hospital. You'll be hearing that and seeing that when you join us at 9 a.m. on YouTube and Facebook. And again, the program is rebroadcast on the radio this afternoon at 5:06. On the radio at 9, Mick Hess is roving with the arts. He is playing music from Rodgers and Hammerstein. Me and Juliet, you will hear that coming up this morning on the radio at 9:06 on KSJE. In addition to Facebook and YouTube, you can also connect with us on Twitter and on Instagram as well. And let's check the weather forecast. It's going to be sunny again today, mostly sunny skies today, 90 for a high in Farmington. Partly cloudy skies overnight with a low of 62. It'll be mostly sunny tomorrow, but there's a chance of an afternoon shower or thunderstorm developing on Friday. The high tomorrow again, 90 degrees, 61 overnight, mostly sunny on Saturday, with a high of 91. 96 on Sunday, sunshine and 97 on Monday, and a high of 96 with sunny skies on Tuesday. Well, let me turn to my guests who are here with me this morning to talk a little bit about archaeology. Paul Reid is back with us from Salmon Ruins and Archaeology Southwest. Paul, good morning.
Good morning, Scott. Glad to be back here.
Good to have you back in the studio.
Yep.
Not from your house.
Live and real.
Right, in person. Social distancing. You're
That's
sitting
right.
way over there. I'm sitting way over here, so that's okay. And you have brought back another special guest this morning.
I have.
Kellan Throgmorton is back with us. And Kellam, good morning to you.
Hey, good morning, Scott. It's great to be here again. I
Good.
think it's about 3 years later.
Yeah, good to have you back because, again, we're seeing an empty chair. And let me fix that.
Yeah.
Let's do that. We'll get Kellam on there. There he is.
Howdy.
Okay. And so, welcome back. Yes, you were here about 3 years ago, we've decided.
I think it was, yes. It was 2017, and I was
Yeah.
just beginning to do some of my dissertation research on the archaeological landscapes of the San Juan Basin and beyond. And I think Paul dragged me in here. We were in the midst of a bit of a foray, driving around, scouting a few sites, looking at some different things.
Yeah, and so people can see that you survived that dissertation, and you're back. No worse for wear.
Yep, no worse for the wear.
Good.
The field work was probably the easy part.
Very good. But you've completed it, right?
I have,
No.
yes, indeed. Got my PhD at Binghamton University in upstate New York in 2019. Finished up, and I have since got a position with Crow Canyon Archaeological Center, which is in Cortez, Colorado. Moved back to Colorado just almost exactly a year ago, I think, this week or last week. and I've been working for Crow Canyon for the last year.
Very good. Well, welcome back to the Four Corners, and you are back again and doing some more work around the region even today, correct?
I am indeed, yes. Down driving and looking at several sites with Paul, and I think in a bit he's going to describe more about the outcome of that project. It's been really great for me to have spent this time focusing on a couple of communities, which I talked about last time I was in here 3 years ago. But just in case people don't remember that far back,
They should. They really should if they're paying attention.
they're really regular listeners.
Yes.
Well, the work that I was doing was focused around understanding differences in Chacoan landscapes. So these are the way that people, ancestral Pueblo folks living here 1,000 years ago, sort of constructed their communities, the way they laid out their communities. It's a kind of cultural geography almost. You know how it feels a little different when you're in Farmington and then you travel to the East Coast and you go to Boston, and the layout of those towns and the way the streets are and the feel of the buildings, really, really different. I was trying to see, can I understand that using archaeological methods on sites in the U.S. Southwest and say, this one feels really different from this one. What is it about that? And then what does that say about the people that lived in those communities? And can we see how they changed over time?
Interesting. And so is that pretty noticeable, I guess, when you study it like you have been doing? Because for many of us, of course, we see a kiva, and unfortunately, to many of us, it looks like another kiva that we've seen 300 miles away. But for you, probably a different story.
I think it is a little bit. You can, especially when you tune into features on the landscape, not just the buildings, but the way the buildings are oriented to natural features, the way that they are aligned in certain different positions, the way that road segments, Chacoan road segments, which I'm sure have been discussed a little bit in here, the way that those are coming into the community in different ways, and especially how they changed over time. I think you can actually measure these things to a certain extent, which tells us a little bit about how the Chacoan world sort of expanded into different communities in the 11th century, the early 12th century. So I think you can identify those, and that was part of what I set out to do.
Right. Interesting. Paul Reid, it seems like we've learned a lot about these areas, but from work that people like Kellam are doing, we continue to learn more about these areas.
Exactly, and that's one of the things that I think is so exciting about Kellam's research, because he's pulled a lot of good work in theory that people have come up with lately in archaeology, and he's spent so much time in the field doing archaeology that he's really mated those well. People tend to be really good field people, or they might be really good theoretical people. Kellam is one of those rare individuals who can really put it all together, and so I think in his dissertation he really has broken new ground in understanding how the Chacoans, how that society developed, because he was looking at communities before Chaco sort of became what we think of as Chaco classically in the 900s and 1000s, looking at those develop, and then he looked at a site fairly close to Farmington up here on the north end that helped him get a really nice contrast with the community sort of on Chaco's southwest corner. So it was a nice comparison of that, and yeah, I think it's really pushed forward what we understand about how groups use the landscape, how they identified themselves in the past, what this sort of Chacoan thing that we've been trying to grasp at for all these years. And I can imagine people are thinking, wow, we've been studying Chaco since, I don't know, take your pick, 1880.
Right.
Lieutenant Simpson on a military expedition went in there in 1849, and that sort of started really good documentation. So after 170 years, what do you people actually know about Chaco? But the thing is, it's a very complicated place, and that's kind of where one of the things I've been intrigued with my own research is I think that sometimes we accept narratives that are overly simplified for places, and we've come to feel, to think that Chaco was the ceremonial center, and I think Kellam and I would both be able to map onto that and say, yeah, it was a ceremonial center, but it was also full of thousands of people doing a whole lot of different things. So Kellam's work has really helped flesh out that situation better and to understand sort of Chaco's roots and how it came to be, this amazing place.
Interesting.
By 900, 1050, right?
Right.
There.
And don't we tend, as just a society or just visitors to those landscapes and to Chaco Canyon and those ruins, maybe fill in the blanks a little bit too? If it's not readily available, do we not sometimes say, well, if this is like this and that's like that, then obviously they must have used this for this purpose, whether we could be so far wrong. Who knows?
Well, that's a tricky thing about it is that we approach things with our common sense, but our common sense is kind of culturally constructed in a way. And so trying to get yourself in the mindset of a group of people who are, in fact, quite different than you. These are the ancestors of modern Pueblo peoples that are building these things, and it's a very different kind of common sense. I'm not going to profess to have actually managed to get inside the head of these folks fully, but I think we can try to say, well, I, with my perspective, would approach this a certain way, but it seems that these folks made very different choices. Can we try to understand those, see how they play out on the landscape, maybe learn a thing or two from that in the present era as well? They have far more experience living on this landscape than many of us have.
Sure, very true. And for both of you, I would say, too, when you make some observations, you try to back up what you're seeing and what you're saying you're seeing with evidence and some of the things that you're gleaning out of the work that you are doing. And that's a lot of what this work is all about, too, is to be able to defend what you're saying.
Right, and again, that's where
Because I know you all like to argue with each other.
No,
You've told me that
we all get
time
along.
and time again.
Now, archaeologists, anthropologists are not argumentative types.
Not at all. You all agree with everybody.
We
Okay.
do.
Okay.
Everybody's right.
Oh.
No, but again, that's really the value of Kellam's research, because he does have such a good handle on worldwide anthropological theory and how people construct identities. He spent a lot of time looking at landscapes worldwide. So then bringing that to a distinct culture at Chaco and in the ancient Pueblo world, he's then able to apply those concepts, but also understand who Pueblo people are, or try to get at that and meld those two things together. Because typically, again, it's one or the other, and getting those things to work together is really difficult. Because, like Kellam says, people go out on the landscape, and the thing that I get a lot, and rarely from archaeologists, but from the public, is they'll go to Chaco and go, God, this is a dry, desolate place, And that's why that notion of a ceremonial center seems to resonate with people, because they look around, they go, nobody could grow corn here. This isn't a great place. In fact, there was a recent study that we have some questions about that showed that there wasn't a whole lot of arable acreage. Another group of researchers came out and said, here are the flaws in that study. So actually, there was a lot of arable acreage in Chaco. And what we do understand about the way Pueblo farmers have worked for a long time on the landscape is they're corn farmers. And people don't settle in areas where they can't plant corn and grow corn. So we kind of circle back to that. So if Chaco is an important ceremonial center, but the roots of that lay on corn farming, corn agriculture, because people just don't pick landscapes and miles from residential places and go, let's go do something there.
Right.
Even worldwide with, the pyramids and all the other things that people really map onto, there's always substantial residential populations that support these areas. So, and I think in Chaco, what really makes it really magical for me is that you've got the residential and the ritual, and it's all right there. And we can't really pull out one aspect or the other of that, because it's, again, like Kellam was saying, it's a worldview thing. Us Western people tend to dichotomize, and we chop up our world in ways that, when we look at indigenous societies, talk to indigenous people, that's not the way they do it. It's much more of an integrated view of it. And so I think those perspectives help a lot if we're trying to understand it.
Sure. Well, and Paul Reid, last time I think we were talking, you were talking about an article about a well-known landmark at Chaco Canyon at Pueblo Bonito, about that tree of life. Right. That new research tends to think that it maybe wasn't a living tree at all. It may have been just something, I don't want to call it a piece of wood, but just something that was at that site, right?
More of an icon almost.
Yeah.
And something that came out of the mountains, which were very important spiritually to people, and that they brought in to, make that connection direct.
But not actually a growing tree.
Right.
Which is depicted in pictures and artwork of that era, supposedly, but it may have been completely wrong.
Right. It may have just simply been something that was there symbolically to connect the people of Pueblo Bonito back to the mountains.
Sure.
So, and then that takes it out of the realm of a living, growing tree. And I think that helps illustrate this idea of sort of stepping out of our Western sort of economic, everything has to connect in, quote, some logical way. Like Kellam said, common sense is a moving target, even now compared to 20 years ago, much less 1,000 years ago.
Very true. Very true. And Kellam, so with your work, were you able to see some of these things? Were you surprised at some of the things that you were coming up with or kind of concluding about?
Yes, indeed. First, to kind of piggyback off of some of what Paul was saying, one of the things I found just from a theoretical perspective was I could do a whole lot of permutations using traditional anthropological theory developed in Europe, a lot of French theorists and British theorists looking at landscape. But I found that I could get to the same results, the same way of looking at landscapes, just working with native authors, native scholars, and saying what have native people said about their own places. It's a much simpler route to begin trying to understand those. And so building a theory of what are the critical parts of an identity for people living in a place, it just highlighted to me how important landscape was among several other things. Some of the stuff that we tended to harp on as archaeologists, like pottery, even architectural style, started to look a little less important when we're trying to discuss the development of like a polity or a large organized system that stretches over great vast distances. It was the landscapes that seemed to be the really critical thing. And as I began looking at that, you could see how there are particular kinds of landscapes that defined a Chacoan way of approaching the world, the way that they wanted to align their communities to put their houses in certain orientations, put these roads in leading to and from different places. And if you had good chronological control, which we're kind of blessed with in the Southwest, you could then step further and further away from Chaco Canyon and sort of see as communities that originally had their very own unique local way of developing a landscape that undoubtedly was a major portion of their identity as people. Those changed as Chacoan buildings arrive, and you see that the entire landscape configuration morphs into this new pattern. And so in a way, I felt like I could almost see Chacoans moving because of the landscapes they were creating in new places, not necessarily because there's a pottery style that we can recognize there, or even an architectural style that sticks out. It really was the landscape that was a key part of saying, this is what Chaco is. This is how it has changed and expanded over the northwest New Mexico, southwest Colorado. And for me, realizing that was a cornerstone of Chacoan identity in the past and of Native American identity in the past, I began looking at the world around me in a different way, especially in these very same Chacoan landscapes today, where we can see infrastructure development, roads, settlements that are, there are people living there in these places today, and there are interest groups that have different reasons that they're trying to develop different kinds of infrastructure. These are all affecting the landscape. And these effects on the landscape, in turn, are going to affect people in various ways. We often think about the effect we have on places, the ecological impacts of various things we do, farming, ranching, oil and gas. But we don't think as much about how those changes actually act back on us and have a big effect on defining who we are as a group of people. So I think that's been one of the interesting things for me, finishing the dissertation work, realizing the importance of these landscapes and landscape change to the identity of people. And then coming back and helping with a project like the one that Paul is working on now, which is fundamentally trying to get a better handle on where the Chacoan landscape is right now, what are some of these communities, and what are some of the impacts that they're facing over the next decade.
Right, and that's the work that you both are doing these days in that area, right?
Right. So we're basically trying to reassess as many of the ancient communities in this 10-mile zone around Chaco. We've talked in the past about legislation that passed the House in 2019 and got to a certain point in the Senate and didn't move further. But the idea was to look at this 10-mile zone as not just a protective area around Chaco, but also for the significance of the communities in that zone itself. Because, prior scholars, this goes way back, certainly more than 100 years, have talked about that zone. So outside the boundaries of the national park, there's an area that's been talked about as the Chaco Halo, which is not exactly correspondent to the 10 miles, but it's pretty close, where you see sites that look a lot like you see in Chaco Canyon. And, so literally just an extension outside the canyon into these other regions.
And for a lot of our listeners and viewers maybe this morning, Paul Reid, they're surprised to learn that maybe outside of Chaco Canyon proper, which is always protected, it's the national park and nothing's ever going to happen to it, but this other zone that you both are talking about is out in the desert around this area, and there really isn't a lot of protections necessarily about things that are maybe underground or haven't been discovered or haven't been excavated, and so to the naked eye, we wouldn't see it, but you guys know that they're out there.
Right. There's a number of communities. We've identified 12, and not all of those are sort of in the zone where we're seeing some of the expansion in the oil and gas development, but at least half of those are areas where we could potentially have interface. And to give a shout out to our local BLM, decades back, they protected some of these areas with their areas of critical environmental concern, what we call ACECs. But there are other communities that haven't seen that level of protection, and that's partly what we're trying to do, is to understand those. How far out do these communities, do these landscape boundaries go? And, what might we propose? As we've discussed on prior shows, the BLM and the BIA are currently modifying long-range plans. We as the public have the opportunity to comment on this, and we have now until September 25th since they, recently pushed the deadline for comments from late May to then. So we're doing this field work. We're trying to get together some maps and some, pretty focused comments to say, well, this area's been protected with some BLM policies and procedures, but what about over here? What about over here? What else might we implement to basically protect these areas and allow us to understand those? And right, a lot of people think, we've protected all the interesting archaeology and the parks and the monuments. And, from my perspective and from Kellam's, I imagine, we've protected a small portion. I wouldn't even throw a number on it, but it's less than 10% or 5% of really sort of critically important resources. Diverse sites across the landscape fall on BLM lands, Navajo Nation lands, state lands. They're everywhere. And the modern land designations are, have their own history, but there's no intersection necessarily between those.
And when we talk about landscapes, and Kellan, with the work that you have done, and if somebody moves in to put something in, whether it's a well pad or a homestead or something else, that is going to disrupt the landscape. It just depends on how much disruption there is, I suppose. But then after that, what does that leave you with? Not much, I suppose.
Well, it can be really difficult to tease these things out. This is coming purely from an archaeological research perspective of just trying to say, how do we get in there, find these things, identify them, observe them, record them. That's a very kind of Western archaeological way of approaching it. But the fact is, the well pads can really make things difficult. Some of the communities I worked with, not far from Farmington, I almost had to do the historic archaeology of oil and gas, which actually is kind of an interest of mine, but you had to do that layer first, peel it all back before you could then reveal these underlying earlier landscapes that highlighted some of these Chacoan patterns. And it really was pulling out the well pads, pulling out the pipelines, figuring out which portions of buildings had been removed over time. Some of this happening in the 1950s, 1940s, before there was really any sort of environmental or archaeological protections on the books. And I think today that's one of the things that people are focused on, is saying we want to forestall those kinds of changes. But first, if we can actually identify where these things are first, we can begin to say there's compelling reasons not to do something here, but over here there might be nothing that's of archaeological interest. That doesn't mean that it's not of interest to communities, Navajo communities living there today, or to Pueblo communities that are at a distance that still have connections to those spots. But at least from an archaeological point of view, we can say this, for the Chacoan story, this is not a major portion of it.
Sure. And folks may be thinking about, well, we've been studying Chaco Canyon for so many years. It's amazing that maybe there's still sites or areas that are unknown in this area, and for development and things like that, why there still comes some potential conflict, I guess, if there's oil and gas potential in that region.
Well, right, Scott, and part of that is just the shifting interest in questions through time, because 150 years ago, people were starting from a European point of view to, quote, discover these places. Of course, ancestral communities had known about them for millennia, but so as they were encountered, there was interest, people recorded certain things, but then we passed through all the subsequent decades of the 20th century and different concerns came up. One of the communities we looked at is known as the Bassani Community, and that was discovered and studied really extensively during a coal project, the Alameda coal lease, which ultimately wasn't developed. So, we were able to visit a site on the BLM out there and look at it, knowing that this site was originally thought to be destroyed, and they might have preserved a portion of it, but it might have been on the edge of a massive coal mine.
Wow.
Because the planned
Right.
development
That
was
was the
not
plan.
unlike the San Juan, or the Navajo mines out to the west of us. But for whatever economic reason, that wasn't developed as a property. So those sites are still with us. But that shows kind of the shifting emphasis in how we use land and energy development and all those things going on. And so now we have some oil and gas coming in, and isn't directly threatening the Bassani community, but it's one of the areas we're concerned about because of this shift in land use. So part of it really is understanding the communities at these different points in time, even just in the last 100 years, but then also bringing new techniques to bear. In the past, and we've talked about this on the show, archaeologists, employed a real dig 'em up type strategy. We wanted to excavate large portions of large sites, and certainly the work at Salmon that I, have helped finish over the years was like that. 100 people on the site at once, digging. Our discipline has evolved out of that, and we're thinking much more creatively about how we we do that to not impact the sites. And of course, a lot of contact with indigenous people, Pueblo people, Navajo people have made us realize that those folks don't want the sites dug up in this way. So we've really improved our techniques for understanding. So we don't find a site today and go, we're going to bring out a bunch of field school students and go at it. We want to understand it with some of the landscape techniques that Kellam employed, some of the more remote sensing things, magnetometer, geophysical work, to see what's under the ground without actually having to dig it. So part of it is the shifting emphasis in the research, the shifting methods, and that allows us to really improve our understanding of some of the communities we've been looking at were initially studied in the early 70s. So it's 50 years later. We have better ways of doing it now. We can put together landscape maps and GIS in ways that they couldn't. So it's sort of these things coming together, and that's part of the rationale for revisiting. Plus, we have oil and gas pushing south towards Chaco in a way that hasn't happened for a few decades. So it's something that we have to figure out.
Sure,
how to balance.
And gentlemen, just have a couple of minutes remaining this morning, but I know, Paul, you've said in the past that you look for a way that kind of everybody can maybe coexist with this region around Chaco Canyon. It's so culturally important and significant, yet there's the demands from oil and gas many times to develop some of those pockets and resources and things like that. It's the BLM's job to kind of use this land in a mixed use type of way. And so do you find yourself sometimes tugged in different directions, or trying to keep warring factions apart, or what do you think is going to happen in the future?
Yeah, I think it's a challenge, and I think Kellam can certainly weigh in on this as well. And we've spent now 6 years working with the agencies, really close contact with a number of the Pueblo tribes, really significant contact with the Navajo Nation, trying to balance these multiple priorities. And I think that's why we're in this critical time when this resource management plan amendment is being considered. BIA has a new environmental impact statement that we're looking at. So the outcomes of this process by the end of the year, early next year, is going to dictate land use policy in this area around Chaco, covering several million acres for 20 years, potentially. So that's why now is the time to get involved and really offer the best advice we can as professionals to the BLM and the BIA. And, we're real sensitive at this point, of course, working with our indigenous native partners to helping raise their voices as well to the extent that we can, and say, these are the concerns that people have about their ancestral landscapes. So let's figure out how to do all this. And, there've been some challenges, quite honestly, in the last couple of years with the new administration that came in 2017 and some shifts. And so we've been working pretty hard to protect the things that matter and, get as many people as we can to support those positions. And, oil and gas is going to be part of the landscape for decades to come still.
Right.
But it's important that we balance that with the people living on the ground and the ancestral landscapes that are so important to so many of us.
Kellan Throgmorton, is that possible to balance those demands on that very precious land?
Well, I think it absolutely is, and I think that we've been using that word balance, and I think it's exactly the word that's most pertinent for this situation, is figuring out what the give and the take is on these kinds of things. I do see room for coexistence. As you walk through these landscapes, you begin to get a sense, just looking at the Chacoan portions of them, of where things are, where things aren't, what might be connected archaeologically speaking. Of course, the archaeology is it's a fraction, maybe even a small fraction of what the real importance of some of these places are, and that's why it's been so instrumental in getting Native people out on the landscape, explaining and demonstrating how its importance is still relevant in their life today. You put these pieces together, and I think that hopefully we can draft up a document that, as Paul says, will last for 20 years and say, here's how we can balance this. We need to make sure that there's give and take. It's not all one thing. It's not all archaeologists. It's not all oil and gas. It's a balance.
Right. Right. Well, very good. Well, gentlemen, it's been a great conversation. Thank you both for coming in. Before we go, Kellan Throgmorton, a quick plug for the Crow Canyon Archaeological Center up there in Cortez.
Yeah, absolutely. I was hoping you'd give me a chance to say that Crow Canyon Archaeological Center, we might not be, we've been affected by COVID in the same way that many people have, and we do not have a participant season as of yet. But we have been offering a series of webinars. You can find us online, and we've been doing our best to do some non-traditional outreach, as we were speaking before coming on the air, just saying that webinars and videos and YouTube channels are a whole new thing. And you can find us there. We've got a YouTube channel. There's crowcanyon.org. You can trace us down there as well. And
Very good.
Definitely
and
check us out.
When things reopen, we can come visit you.
Absolutely. Yep. We're actually
Wonderful.
working on some Chacoan landscapes as we speak, and hopefully have some great programming for you coming up in the near future.
Wonderful. But like everyone, you've got a lot of stuff online that folks can check
We
out.
do. Yes, indeed.
And enjoy it. So very good. Paul, thanks for coming in.
Thanks, Scott. Great to be back, and we'll do it again.
Always good to see you. And we'll see you next month.
Yes.
All right. Very good. Kellan Throgmorton, congratulations again on finishing up your dissertation, and thank you for sharing that with us.
Oh, thank you very much for having me back on.
You bet. It's great to see you both. Thanks for coming in. My guest this morning right here on KSJE. And I'll be back with more in just a moment, everybody. The time right now is coming up on 8:39.
As advertisers boycott social media over hate speech, creators also face a drop in revenue. From America.